Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. In the last video that I made, we talked about a deal breaker or a deal maker regarding Jesus. His detractors, and you read this in John 2 if you want, his detractors ask him for a sign that would confirm his authority. It's always about authority. And Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. Now, they thought that he was talking about the temple that was standing there, the Jewish temple. And in a sense he was, because that would be destroyed, but not in 3 days. And so he's talking about the temple of his body. Bottom line is this. Jesus said, if I'm resurrected from the dead, if my body is restored, not just his body restored, but he has a new body, a heavenly body, a spiritual body, it's a physical body, then that confirms his credentials. He is, Romans 10:9 says, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, well, that means who he says he is. We're believing what he says. And then we also believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead. We're believing what he does. So, and then it says we're saved. It's a faith thing, but it's not unreasonable faith at all. I want to address the idea of death itself as a Christian, let's say, or biblical solution to what philosophers have said for years is the greatest problem. For years, most philosophers will agree that death is the only real problem. Well, why is that? Because it speaks to the idea of the reason for our existence. Is there a purpose for our life or not? And of course, I realize that the materialistic culture today, the scientific so-called culture today, doesn't think that there is any purpose for life because everything's an accident. We're just here randomly, and there's no real reason for our being here. I think that's maybe the greatest question that we all should be asking ourselves. Am I here for any purpose beyond my own wants and local needs, let's say? Or is there a greater purpose? That was my issue, of course, years and years ago when I eventually became a believer. So my point is this: if death is it, of course it's a philosopher's problem, because what do they make of it? What do they make of life itself or existence itself? It's death is all there is. I mean, if life is all there is and then you die and that's it. Said another way, if you sum total every number, you add all the numbers here, and they all, no matter what numbers you plug in, they all come up with zero, then the sum total of everything's zero. It doesn't matter what numbers you plug in. Well, that would be true then about if death is oblivion. It doesn't matter how you live because the sum total of every life is zero. So if you're Hitler or Mother Teresa, or if maybe you don't like Mother Teresa, somebody else that you think is great, it doesn't matter because the sum total is zero. And I know there are other arguments about that. Some would say, well, your life counts while it lives, and maybe the next life does, but it still all ends up with zero, including our whole universe, which is by the law of entropy running out of energy, and sometime in the future will not exist anymore either. So my point is this, that if anything can be solved, it's got to be death. If any purpose, for our ultimate purpose, for our existence is real, we have to solve the problem of death. And Christianity does that. Now, other religions might in some way do that too, but Christianity really targets the idea of rising from the dead. Think about it. You're conquering your death. You're conquering the philosopher's greatest problem. So Christians say, from biblical evidence, that death is the last enemy. So Jesus rose from the dead, and in doing that, he conquered death. Physically, it would also say there is no victory in the grave. And so what do we make of that? Well, remember, Jesus' number one credential, if I'm risen from the dead, that's my credential. Everything else has to be true. If I'm just died and that's the end of it, I'd have no credentials. I'm just like everybody else. So we want to know, did it happen? If it happened, that's a big deal. If it didn't happen, that's not a big deal. And it's subjective. It either did or not did happen. And so I want to talk to for the rest of this, just a little brief thing here, about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, all history is a little different than science. I understand that. It's not a 1 and 1 plus 2. It's more of a inductive reasoning. It's the best explanation for what we know the historical facts are. And Christians and non-Christians, scholars of all stripes, would agree with the following historical facts, things that we can know for sure. The first one is that Jesus really is a historical person, that he really lived. Now, there are a couple of historians who would disagree with that. I'm thinking of Richard Carrier. There's one other guy, Robert somebody, I can't remember right now. Anyway, but they're really on the outside. Most historians agree, even Bart Ehrman, the atheistic Bible scholar, let's say, knows that Jesus is a real person because there's so much extra outside of the Bible evidence for that. We also know that Jesus was crucified under the reign of Tiberius, the Roman emperor, and the Roman governor of Palestine, Pontius Pilate. We know that. We know that outside of the Bible. We don't need the Bible to know either one of those things. We also can know, and this is amazing about historical consensus here, we know that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Vast majority of scholars would concede that point, and there are good reasons for that. That probably would take a 10-minute lesson on its own, so I'm not going to belabor that today. But just know this. Let's back up a little bit. We can know that Jesus was a real person, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that he was buried. The fact that he was buried is really important. Why? Because if he wasn't buried, there is no empty tomb. If there is no empty tomb, then nobody at that time in the first century could have or would have believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Think about this. We call it the Jerusalem factor. Jesus, we know, was crucified in Jerusalem. And 3 days later, of course, his tomb was found empty. Even his enemies attested that. They wanted to tell us why the tomb was empty, because the disciples stole the body. But the tomb was empty. So if the tomb is empty, those same people, get this now, those same people who were swamped and packed in Jerusalem, those people would have gone to the tomb and found out if it was empty. If the disciples start preaching, God has raised Jesus from the dead, if there is no empty tomb, as evidence for that, as evidence that says he's not here, nobody would have believed that. The truth is, the disciples themselves wouldn't have believed in it. They weren't expecting a resurrection. And so that's a historical consensus thing, and there's other good reasons for that from an historical standpoint. So we have these 4 facts so far. Jesus is a real person. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was buried in Joseph's tomb, and the tomb was empty 3 days later. There's one more fact that is really important. Now, understand this. The fact is that those disciples truly believed that they had experienced the resurrected Jesus. They truly believed that. How do we know that? Because they died rather than to deny it. Nobody makes up a lie or a story that they know is false and then dies for it. They died only for what they knew was true. Now, this is different than other sacrificial deaths, let's say. If I die for something that I believe that I have no personal knowledge of, I just believe it, maybe I will die for it. But if I know for a fact whether something is true or not, only if I'm convinced that what I experienced is true. If I had to know one way or the other if Jesus is risen from the dead in the first century, in those 40 days following, then I know for a fact if he's not risen from the dead, and even if I wanted to believe it, I'd know in my heart this didn't happen. I wasn't there. But if they are there and they know that Jesus has risen from the dead by their own experience, then they become true martyrs. So those are 5 facts now, historical facts. And by the way, all historians of all stripes agree with those 5 facts. They just don't know how to draw the conclusion that the only alternative is God raised Jesus from the dead. And honestly, we probably need to do another video about that because there are no alternative explanations. And I'll list a few, the first one being maybe the disciples stole the body. That doesn't follow, because if they stole the body, they would not have believed that God raised Jesus from the dead. But we know they really did believe that God raised Jesus from the dead because they were willing to die for it. In their own experience, they knew for a fact whether it was true or not. Some would say maybe they went to the wrong tomb. That's not credible. Some would, back in the earlier times, they would have, maybe Jesus didn't quite die. That's not credible either. Think about it. What is the only explanation for these 5 facts? And if you just say, well, maybe there is a God, that's pretty credible. And if there is a God, then God can work miracles. And this just happens to solve the ultimate problem from the beginning of philosophy. Death is the only problem. This solves the death problem. The wages of sin, the payment for our sins against God, is death, separation from God. Jesus came to pay for our sins by dying. The wages of sin is death. And he conquered, he paid that completely as a gift to us by rising from the dead. He's out of jail. The debt has been paid. I hope this makes sense to you, and we'll talk more about it in future videos. Thanks for watching.